The clay is cool against your fingertips, 4,000 years cool. In the climate-controlled vault beneath the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, you're holding a terracotta prism roughly the size of a large candle. Its four faces covered in wedge-shaped impressions, so small they look like bird tracks in dried mud. The catalogue reads WB 1923.444, the Weld Blundell prism, found in Larsa, Iraq in 1922 by Herbert Weld Blundell himself, excavated from a room that had been sealed since approximately 1800 BCE. Before you comment where you're watching from and what time it is there, consider this. That measurement you're about to type, those hours, those minutes, those seconds, they come from the same civilization that pressed these marks into wet clay 2 centuries ago. The system you use to measure your morning coffee, your commute, your sleep, was already ancient when this prism was fired. The text carved into this object is called the Sumerian King List. It claims to document every ruler from the moment kingship descended from heaven until the dynasty of Assene around 1763 BC. Scholars have known about it for a century. They've catalogued it, translated it, debated its historical accuracy. What makes people uncomfortable isn't what's written in the later sections. Those names match archaeological evidence, reign lengths seem plausible, cities check out. It's the beginning that creates problems. Before the flood, the text states, 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years. Not generations, years. One king named Elulim supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. Another, Enmenluana, held power for 43,200 years. The city of Bad Tibera had 3 kings who collectively governed for 108,000 years. When you reach the end of this antediluvian section, just before the floodwaters rise in the narrative, the text makes a simple statement. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, everything changes. The reign lengths drop dramatically. Kings rule for 1,200 years, then 600, then numbers that start approaching human lifespans. It's as if whatever system of measurement existed before the flood used a different scale, or measured something other than solar years, or recorded something we no longer know how to read. Mainstream scholarship treats these pre-flood figures as mythological exaggeration, symbolic numbers representing ancient prestige. The consensus is clear. The Sumerian king list begins with legend and gradually transitions into history. The first archaeologically verified king on the list is Emabaragesi of Kish, around 2600 BC, nearly halfway through the document. Everything before that is considered mythology. But here's what nobody disputes. This prism and the 16 other fragmentary versions of the king list that survive all maintain the same structure. The pre-flood kings existed. They ruled for impossible lengths. Then came water. Then came different kings with different numbers. The Sumerians, who kept meticulous records of grain shipments and property transactions with boring accuracy, chose to begin their royal chronology with figures they knew would sound absurd. Why? Not why did they believe it, why did they write it down as history rather than myth? The Sumerians had mythological texts. They knew the difference. Their myths about gods fighting monsters were written in a different grammatical form, a different literary structure. The king list uses the same dry, administrative language as their economic records. City name, king name, reign length. Next, it's formatted like a database, not an epic. And throughout this list, woven into the matter-of-fact recitation of rulers, appears a term that shows up across hundreds of Sumerian texts from multiple cities over more than 1,000 years, Anunnaki. The word means, roughly, those who from heaven to earth came. In the administrative and religious texts, they're described as beings who established kingship, who gave the ME a Sumerian word that gets translated as divine powers, but which the texts describe as transferable objects. things that could be physically moved from one location to another, taken, stolen, gifted. The ME included writing, metalworking, city planning, mathematics, irrigation, legal systems, music, medicine. The texts say the Anunnaki gave these things to humanity, not that humans invented them, gave them, past tense, completed action. And then, in most of the narratives, the Anunnaki departed or withdrew to the background, leaving humans to manage the systems. If you treat this as mythology, it's interesting. Ancient people crediting gods for cultural achievements, standard religious literature. But if you treat the king list as the Sumerians treated it, as a historical record, then you're faced with a different question. What if these texts aren't describing gods in the supernatural sense? What if they're describing the source attribution for technologies that appeared suddenly, fully developed, with no archaeological evidence of gradual invention? What if Anunnaki was the Sumerian word for whoever or whatever came before them and left behind functioning systems? Because here's what archaeology actually shows. Sumerian civilization appears around 4500 BC in southern Mesopotamia with sophisticated urban planning, complex irrigation networks, mathematical systems, written language, wheel technology, metallurgy, and architectural techniques that required advanced geometry. There are no primitive prototypes, no evidence of gradual development from simple to complex. The agricultural settlements that preceded Sumerian cities show nothing approaching this level of organisation. Then, within a few centuries, you have urban centres with populations in the tens of thousands, monumental architecture, long-distance trade networks, and a writing system complex enough to handle administrative, literary, and mathematical content. It's not impossible that humans invented all of this independently in a short span. Necessity drives innovation. Collective intelligence compounds. But it's also true that the Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented these things. Every origin story in their vast literary corpus attributes foundational technologies to the Anunnaki or to specific Anunnaki figures, Enki, Enlil, Inanna, Ninhursag. Setting down the Weld Blundell prism, you notice your phone screen. The time display reads 3:47 p.m, 3 hours, each divided into 60 minutes. Each minute divided into 60 seconds. That's 13,420 seconds since noon. You didn't invent that system. Neither did the Romans, though we use some of their month names. Neither did the Greeks, though we credit them with geometry. The 60-based measurement of time comes from Sumer and Babylon. Specifically, it comes from the sexagesimal system they used for mathematics, which they said they received from the gods. Every clock in the world runs on Sumerian time. Every compass and protractor divides the circle into 360 degrees, a number derived from the sexagesimal system the Babylonians inherited from the Sumerians, who attributed it to divine teaching. Navigation, architecture, engineering, astronomy, all still using the mathematical framework from texts written in cuneiform. The question isn't whether Sumerian technology still functions. You're using it right now. As you read these words, you're employing a technology, written language, that appears suddenly in the archaeological record around 3400 BC in Uruk, with no transitional forms showing how it developed from simpler notation systems. The Sumerians said the goddess Nisaba invented writing. Modern scholars say writing evolved from accounting tokens, but the tokens are pictographic marks. Writing is phonetic. The leap from this image means this thing to this image means this sound, which can combine with other sounds to mean anything, is enormous. And it happened, archaeologically speaking, overnight. The wheel, another Sumerian first, around 3500 BC, appears in the form of potters' wheels for creating ceramics. Within a few centuries, wheels are on carts, then chariots. There's no archaeological evidence of experimental wheels that didn't work. No failed prototypes. Just sudden appearance of functional wheel technology that immediately gets applied to multiple domains. The Sumerians credited this innovation to divine instruction. Irrigation systems channeling water from the Tigris and Euphrates to fields miles away, using principles of gradient and flow that modern hydraulic engineers still follow. Sumerian texts attribute these canal systems to Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom. The Gudea cylinders, two massive clay drums inscribed around 2125 BC and now housed in the Louvre, contain detailed instructions for temple construction, including exact measurements, material specifications, and astronomical alignments. Gudea, the ruler of Lagash, claims the god Ningesu appeared to him in a dream and showed him the architectural plans. The resulting structure, the Temple of Eninu, was built to specifications that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of load-bearing, foundation stability, and water management. Mathematics precise enough to calculate Pythagorean triples more than a millennium before Pythagoras, recorded on a tablet called Plimpton 322, now in Columbia University's collection. Medical texts describing diagnostic procedures and pharmaceutical recipes that parallel modern practices found in tablet archives across multiple Sumerian cities. Astronomical observations accurate enough to predict planetary movements and lunar eclipses, compiled in a 70-tablet series called Enuma Anu Enlil, containing roughly 7,000 individual omens based on celestial patterns. All of it appears suddenly, all of it attributed to Anunnaki teaching or divine instruction, all of it still in use, in various forms, today. This isn't an argument that ancient aliens visited Mesopotamia. It's not a claim that the Sumerian gods were literal supernatural beings. It's an observation, the technological foundation of modern civilization, how we measure time, how we write, how we calculate, how we build, how we organize cities, how we manage water, how we predict astronomical events, traces back to a specific time and place where the people who developed these systems said repeatedly in every available text that they didn't invent them, they said they received them. From whom? From what? From a civilization that preceded the flood and left enough knowledge behind that it could be reconstructed? From a long process of development whose evidence was lost to time? From sources the Sumerians genuinely believed were divine? The answer changes nothing about the technology. It functions regardless of origin. When you check your phone and see that it's been 60 seconds since you started reading this paragraph, you're using a measurement system that survives from a civilization that measured time the same way and claimed they learned it from beings who came from the sky. This isn't about proving the Anunnaki were real in any particular sense. It's about following a more interesting question. What did the Sumerians actually leave behind that still works? Not as museum curiosities or archaeological puzzles, but as active, operational systems embedded so deeply in modern life that we don't think of them as Sumerian at all. We think of them as just how things are. They're not. They're how the Sumerians said things should be organized. And they were right. The systems work. They've worked for 4,000 years. They'll work tomorrow when you wake up and check the time. The prism in the Oxford Vault doesn't answer why the antediluvian kings have impossible rain lengths. It doesn't prove the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials or advanced humans or metaphorical representations of natural forces. It just sits there, a dense clay cylinder inscribed with a king list that treats pre-flood and post-flood rulers with the same documentary formality as if the scribes who copied this text around 1800 BC believed they were recording history, not mythology. And beside it, in archives and museums across the world, sit hundreds of thousands of other tablets. Most haven't been translated yet. Some were just recently excavated. Many contain technical information we're still deciphering, astronomical calculations, mathematical tables, engineering specifications, medical formulas, chemical processes. They all have one thing in common. they describe their knowledge as received, not invented. The Sumerians positioned themselves as inheritors and stewards of systems they attributed to the Anunnaki. Whether you interpret that as religious belief, historical memory, or metaphorical teaching, the systems themselves remain functional, testable, reproducible. This is not ancient history, this is the operating system of your daily life, written in cuneiform, preserved in clay, attributed to sources the scribes called Anunnaki. What they left behind isn't in museums, it's in your pocket, on your wall, in the roads you drive, the buildings you enter, the time you keep, the words you read, the calculations you make without thinking. The question isn't whether Anunnaki technology still functions. The question is whether you're ready to recognize it. The clay that remembers. Southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, approximately 4500 BC. The archaeological designation is the Ubaid period, transitioning into the Uruk period. In terms of what came before, small agricultural villages, mud brick houses, some irrigation, basic pottery, domesticated animals and grain cultivation, population centres of maybe a few hundred people, no writing, no wheels, no cities. Then, over the span of roughly 5 centuries, which sounds like a long time until you consider it's about twice the length of time between the invention of the printing press and the invention of the internet, everything changes. By 3500 BC, you have Uruk, a city, not a large village or a town, but an actual urban centre covering 6 square kilometres with a population estimated between 40,000 and 80,000 people. To put that in perspective, Athens during the classical period, at the height of its power, when Plato was teaching and Aristotle was thinking and democracy was supposedly flourishing, had a population of about 30,000 citizens plus slaves and foreigners. Uruk was larger than classical Athens 18 centuries earlier. The city contained monumental architecture, the White Temple, built on top of a ziggurat 40 feet tall, constructed from millions of mud bricks. The mathematics required to build a structure that won't collapse under its own weight, that distributes load properly, that accounts for the expansion and contraction of materials with temperature changes, with moisture, that's not trial and error construction, that's applied geometry. The Yana district of Uruk contained multiple large buildings, including the limestone temple and the pillared hall, structures requiring coordinated labour forces numbering in the thousands. The organisation alone is staggering. You need architects, engineers, mathematicians who can calculate angles and stresses, supply chains to bring materials, food production sufficient to feed workers who aren't farming, administrative systems to coordinate it all, and writing. By 3400 BC, cuneiform script appears in Uruk. Not simple pictograms, not hash marks for counting. A full writing system capable of recording language with grammatical complexity. The earliest tablets found in Uruk contain administrative records, accounts of grain, livestock, textiles, labour. The system is already sophisticated enough to handle abstract concepts, numerical notation, and grammatical markers. There is no evidence of a transitional phase. No tablets showing primitive attempts at writing that gradually become more complex. The earliest examples are already functional. Scholars theorize that writing must have developed from accounting tokens, small clay objects used to track goods. But tokens are just tokens. They represent objects. Writing represents sounds and concepts. The cognitive leap is immense, and archaeologically it appears to happen instantaneously. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented writing. The creation of cuneiform is attributed to Nisaba, goddess of grain and writing, sometimes to Nabu, god of wisdom and scribes. The myths don't describe gradual development, they describe a gift, a moment when writing came into existence, complete and functional. This pattern repeats across every major technological domain. The wheel appears around 3500 BC in Sumerian contexts. Potter's wheels first, then transport wheels. No evidence of experimental failures. No gradually improving designs, just functional wheels that work well enough to immediately proliferate across multiple applications. Modern pottery wheels operate on the same basic principle as the wheels found in Sumerian archaeological sites. The Sumerians said this technology was divine instruction. Mainstream archaeology says it must have been invented through trial and error, but the trial and error left no archaeological trace. Irrigation systems appear with similar suddenness. The network of canals channeling water from the Euphrates to fields across the Mesopotamian plain required sophisticated understanding of hydraulics. Water flows downhill, everyone knows that, but controlling flow rates, preventing erosion, managing silt build-up, ensuring even distribution across multiple branching channels, avoiding salinization of soil, that requires knowledge of gradient calculations, soil composition, long-term environmental effects. The Sumerians built systems that function well enough to support city-states for thousands of years. In the myths, irrigation technology is attributed to Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and crafts. The texts describe him as establishing the Abzu, the underground freshwater realm, and teaching humans how to tap into water sources and channel them for agriculture. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 1673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes Enki's role in founding Eridu, the first city, and establishing the irrigation systems that made civilization possible. Eridu itself presents an archaeological puzzle. The site, located in southern Iraq at Tel Abu Sharain, has been excavated multiple times, most extensively by Iraqi and British teams. The findings show continuous occupation from approximately 5400 BCE through 600 BCE. That's nearly 5,000 years of settlement. The temple complex dedicated to Enki, called the Abzu, was rebuilt multiple times on the same spot, each iteration built directly on top of the previous one, creating a layered mound of 17 sequential temple phases. The earliest levels of the temple show planning and organisation. These aren't haphazard shrines. They're oriented according to cardinal directions. They have foundation deposits. They show evidence of ritual practice that remains consistent across millennia. The Sumerians considered Eridu the oldest city in the world. Modern archaeology confirms it's one of the earliest permanent settlements in Mesopotamia and possibly the world. But here's the question nobody has answered satisfactorily. Why does complex urban civilization appear first in southern Mesopotamia, one of the more challenging environments for sustaining large populations? The region is hot, arid, prone to flooding, and lacks natural resources like stone, timber, and metal ore. Everything needed for construction and toolmaking has to be imported. The rivers flood unpredictably. Salt accumulation in irrigated soil is a constant threat. There are far easier places to build a civilization. River valleys with more predictable flooding, like the Nile. Coastal areas with access to multiple biomes. Regions with accessible metal deposits. Yet complex urban life, cities, writing, mathematics, monumental architecture, develops first in one of the least hospitable places, requiring sophisticated irrigation technology just to survive. The standard explanation is that challenge drives innovation. Necessity creates invention. But that assumes the Sumerians were the ones doing the inventing. What if they were the ones doing the rebuilding? Every Sumerian text that discusses origins makes the same basic claim: the Anunnaki established civilization. The word Anunnaki is usually translated as gods, but etymologically it means something closer to those who from heaven to earth came, or offspring of An and Ki, An being the sky, Ki being the earth. They're described as arriving, not as always existing. They're described as teaching, not as creating ex nihilo. The pantheon is extensive, hundreds of named deities, but certain figures appear repeatedly in connection with specific technologies. Enki, water management, wisdom, crafts, magic; Enlil, agriculture, kingship, divine authority, city planning; Inanna Ishtar, warfare, love, political power. Ninhursag, birth, medicine, brewing. Nisaba, writing, accounting, grain. Each deity has a domain of knowledge, but the texts don't describe these as abstract concepts. They describe them as me, a Sumerian word that has no perfect translation. Scholars render it as divine powers or attributes of civilization, but in the narratives, me behave like objects, physical things that can be counted, transported, stolen, transferred. The most explicit description appears in the myth Inanna and Enki, preserved across multiple tablets in the University of Pennsylvania's collection and other museums. The story describes Inanna travelling to Eridu to visit Enki. He gets drunk during their feast and offers her the me, all of them, over 100 individual powers, including kingship, priesthood, truth, descending into the underworld, ascending from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of straightforwardness, the art of metalworking, leatherworking, building, grain distribution, weaving, scribeship, craftsmanship, law, libel, and destruction of cities. Inanna accepts them. Enki, once sober, realizes what he's done and sends his servant to retrieve them. Inanna escapes to Uruk in her boat, carrying the me. When she arrives, she distributes them to her city, establishing Uruk as a centre of civilization. If you read this as mythology, it's a story about political rivalry between cities, with Eridu Enki representing old authority and Uruk Inanna representing new power. That interpretation is valid and well supported. But read it literally, and it describes a physical transfer of technological knowledge from one location to another. The me aren't described as spiritual enlightenment or abstract cultural achievements. They're described as things Inanna loads into a boat and physically transports. The text lists them, 100 me, each with a specific name, each representing a specific capability. What if me were information packages, templates for organising civilization, not supernatural powers, but systematized knowledge in a form that could be transmitted, copied, implemented? The Sumerian language has terms for different types of knowledge. Zu means knowing facts. Gozu means great knowledge or wisdom. Ar means foundation or basis. Me seems to occupy a unique category, knowledge that enables functionality. The me of kingship doesn't mean knowing what a king is. It means possessing the framework to organise and legitimise political authority. The me of metalworking doesn't mean understanding that metal exists. It means having the techniques to extract, refine, alloy, and forge it. Archaeology shows that metallurgy appears in Mesopotamia during the Uruk period. Bronze production, smelting, sophisticated alloying. The technology is imported or developed, but either way, it arrives rapidly. Copper and tin deposits don't exist locally, so trade networks spanning hundreds of miles must be established. That requires political organisation, diplomatic relations, economic systems for long-distance exchange, and the mathematical ability to track complex transactions. The Sumerians said the me of metalworking came from the Anunnaki. Modern archaeology says metallurgy developed through experimentation and trade. Both can be true if the Anunnaki aren't supernatural beings, but an earlier source of technological knowledge, whether that's a predecessor civilization, a pre-flood culture, or accumulated wisdom from a longer developmental period than the archaeological record currently shows. The flood is the other constant in Sumerian literature. Not occasional floods, those happen regularly and are well documented. The flood, singular, catastrophic, world-ending. Multiple texts describe it. The Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, sections of the Gilgamesh epic. Each version differs in details, but agrees on the core narrative. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. One god warned a human to build a boat. The human survived and preserved animals and craftsmen. The water receded. Civilization resumed. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on CBS 10673, is fragmentary but clear. It describes kingship descending from heaven to 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. It names kings. Then the text breaks and resumes with discussion of the flood. After the flood, kingship is re-established, but in different cities. The antediluvian cities are either abandoned or destroyed. Post-flood civilization begins in Kish. Archaeological evidence shows a break. Around 2900 BCE, there's a sediment layer in multiple Mesopotamian sites consistent with major flooding. It's not enough sediment to support a global flood, but it's enough to indicate significant regional flooding that could have devastated the early Sumerian city-states. After this layer, there's evidence of cultural change, new pottery styles, different settlement patterns, shifts in political organisation. If you're a civilization dependent on irrigation agriculture, and your canal systems are destroyed by massive flooding, you're facing near total collapse. If your seed stores are destroyed, your livestock drowned, your fields buried in silt, you're starting over. But if you have records, clay tablets that survive water damage, written instructions for rebuilding irrigation networks, mathematical tables for recalculating canal gradients, architectural plans for reconstructing temples, you can restore what was lost. That's the pattern the Sumerian texts describe. Before the flood, cities, kingship, knowledge. After the flood, rebuilding, restoration, re-establishing what existed before. Not inventing civilization for the first time, but recovering it. The Weld Blundell Prism lists antediluvian kings who ruled for impossible lengths, then post-flood kings who ruled for plausible lengths. What if the pre-flood numbers aren't measuring time the same way? What if they're measuring something else? Dynastic cycles, lunar months, institutional continuity, using units that were lost or changed after the flood. The scribes who copied the king list around 1800 BC were working from older sources they may not have fully understood, preserving numbers they couldn't contextualize but wouldn't alter. This is standard practice in Sumerian scribal culture. The Aduba, the school for scribes, operated on the principle of precise copying. Errors were unacceptable. Even when copying texts the scribes no longer understood, they reproduced them exactly, often adding notes, "I don't understand this line," or "this section is damaged in the original." They valued accuracy over comprehension. So when the king list records that Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, the scribes weren't inventing numbers, they were copying them from earlier sources. What those numbers originally meant is lost. That they were considered historically accurate by the Sumerians is documented. The Sumerians positioned themselves as inheritors, not inventors. They described their cities as ancient, their temples as rebuilt on primordial foundations, their knowledge as received from the Anunnaki. Whether that's religious belief, cultural memory, or historical documentation depends on what you think the Anunnaki were. But the technology is real. The mathematics work. The irrigation systems function. The architectural principles are sound. The astronomical observations are accurate. The medical procedures are effective. The wheel turns. The writing preserves information. The time measurement divides days into manageable units. All of it appears in southern Mesopotamia within a narrow time window, attributed to sources the Sumerians called Anunnaki, organized according to principles they said they were taught, not principles they claimed to have discovered. If they were rebuilding after the flood, they succeeded. If they were implementing inherited knowledge, they did so with remarkable consistency. If they were receiving divine instruction, the gods were excellent engineers. What remains, written in clay tablets scattered across museum collections worldwide, is the oldest surviving documentation of civilization-level technology, not descriptions of how to make arrowheads or pottery. Instructions for organizing cities, managing water, calculating time, recording information, coordinating large-scale construction, predicting celestial events, diagnosing disease, administering justice. The Sumerians called it the work of the Anunnaki, Modern scholarship calls it the invention of civilization. The difference is attribution, not function. The systems work regardless of who designed them, and they're still working. When you measure a minute, you're using their mathematics. When you write a word, you're using their information technology. When you see a wheeled vehicle, you're seeing their mechanical engineering. When water flows through irrigation channels, it flows according to their hydraulics. The clay tablets remember what the Sumerians built and why they said they built it. 4,000 years later, the buildings are rubble, the cities are buried under sand, the temples are archaeological sites, but the technology is everywhere, still functioning, still organising how you structure your day, navigate your world, and record your thoughts. The question was never whether it works. The question is whether we're willing to ask where it really came from. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 60 centuries. Look at a clock, any clock, digital, analog, sundial, atomic, doesn't matter. It divides time the same way. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. This isn't arbitrary. This isn't natural. A second is not a unit that appears in nature. Neither is a minute. Neither is an hour. These are inventions. Specifically, they're Sumerian inventions. The sexagesimal system, base 60 instead of base 10, appears in Mesopotamian mathematical tablets dating to the early 3rd millennium BC, not as an experimental system, not as one option among many, as the standard for calculation. Scribes learning mathematics in the Adaba practice multiplication tables in base 60 the same way modern students learn times tables in base 10. The difference is that base 10 matches our anatomy, we have 10 fingers. Base 60 doesn't match anything obvious in human experience, which raises the question, why 60? The answer the Sumerians gave, because that's how the Anunnaki organised it. The answer modern mathematics gives, because 60 is extraordinarily useful. 60 is the smallest integer divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. It's divisible by 10, 12, 15, 20 and 30. You can split it into halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, sixths, tenths, twelfths, 15ths, 20ths, 30ths. Base 10 is divisible by 1, 2, 5 and 10. Much less flexible. If you're designing a system for measuring and dividing quantities, base 60 is mathematically optimal for a pre-calculator culture. It allows fractional calculations without needing decimal notation. Half of 60 is 30, a whole number. A third of 60 is 20, whole number. A quarter is 15. A fifth is 12. This matters enormously when you're surveying land, dividing inheritance, calculating grain distributions, or organising labour teams. But here's the thing, base 60 is not intuitive. It's not the counting system you'd invent naturally. Children don't spontaneously count to 60 before starting over. That would require memorising 60 unique symbols or number words before you have a conceptual framework for larger quantities. It's cognitively easier to count to 10, establish that pattern, then extend it, which is what most human cultures do. The Sumerian system uses base 10 for number words, but base 60 for calculation. They counted in tens for everyday speech, but calculated in 60s for mathematics and astronomy. That's not a simple system. That's a sophisticated bifurcated system that requires training to use properly. And it's the system that governs every measurement of time and angle on Earth today. When ancient Sumerians divided the day into 12 segments and each segment into 30 smaller units, they created the hour and minute. When they divided the circle into 360 degrees, 6x 60, they created the geometric standard that every protractor, compass and navigation system uses. GPS satellites calculate your position using degrees, minutes and seconds of arc. Your latitude and longitude are measured in a coordinate system derived from the Sumerian sexagesimal framework. This isn't coincidental cultural transmission, it's direct inheritance. The system passed from Sumer to Babylon to Assyria to Persia to Greece to Rome, to medieval Europe, to the global modern standard. There were opportunities to change it. Different cultures used different calendar systems, different year lengths, different month names, but nobody successfully replaced base 60 for time and angle measurement. Attempts were made. During the French Revolution, decimal time was briefly introduced. 10-hour days, 100-minute hours. It failed. People couldn't adjust. The sexagesimal system was too embedded. Why? Because it works better. For dividing a day into work periods, base 60 allows more precise fractional scheduling. A quarter of an hour is 15 minutes, clean division. A third of an hour is 20 minutes, clean. A sixth is 10 minutes. Try doing that with decimal time and you get awkward decimals: 0.25 hours, 0.333 hours, 0.166 hours. Before calculators, that's functionally useless. The Sumerians and the Babylonians who inherited their mathematics didn't have calculators. They had clay tablets and reed styluses. Every calculation had to be done by hand, often by looking up values in pre-calculated tables. Dozens of Sumerian mathematical tablets survive: multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, tables of squares, cube roots, exponential series. These weren't theoretical mathematics. These were practical tools used by scribes, surveyors, architects, and administrators. One such tablet, designated IM 67118 in the Iraq Museum, contains a table of reciprocals calculated to extraordinary precision. Reciprocals are essential for division in a multiplication-based system. If you want to divide by 5, you multiply by 1/5. The tablet lists reciprocals for every regular sexagesimal number, numbers whose reciprocals can be expressed as finite sexagesimal fractions. The interesting part, the Sumerians identified which numbers don't have finite reciprocals and flagged them as irregular. 7, 11, 13, these produce infinite sexagesimal fractions, just as a third produces an infinite decimal fraction, 0.333. That's sophisticated number theory. That's understanding the mathematical properties of your base system at a level that requires formal instruction and conceptual clarity. Another tablet, CBS 19761 from the University of Pennsylvania collection, is a student practice tablet showing calculation of the area of an irregular plot of land. The student uses base 60 notation to multiply length by width, makes an error, and the teacher has corrected it with different coloured stylus marks. It's a homework assignment from approximately 2000 BC, demonstrating that sexagesimal mathematics was taught systematically in schools. These weren't elite skills reserved for priests. This was standard scribal education. If you wanted to work in administration, temple management, or any trade requiring measurement, you learned base 60 math. The system was widespread because it was functional. But where did it come from? The Sumerians attributed mathematical knowledge to Enki and Nisaba. Enki as the god of wisdom and precise measurement. Nisaba as the goddess of accounting and scribal arts. There's a hymn to Nisaba, preserved across multiple copies, that describes her as she who holds the lapis lazuli, measuring rod and golden stylus, the scribe, the woman radiant with joy, the measuring rod, the tool of surveyors and architects, the stylus, the tool of calculation and record keeping. In Sumerian cosmology, measurement is divine. The universe is organised according to ME, those divine powers or principles. Among the ME that Inanna acquires in the Enki myth are the art of the metal worker, the art of the scribe, the art of the leather worker, the art of the builder. Each craft has an art, AME, a systematic body of knowledge. Mathematics is the ME that underlies all other ME. You can't build without geometry. You can't survey without calculation. You can't administer grain stores without arithmetic. You can't predict eclipses without astronomy, which requires arithmetic, geometry, and observation. Mathematics is infrastructure knowledge. It enables everything else. and the Sumerians said it was taught to them, not in vague mythological terms, in specific terms. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, derived from earlier Sumerian sources, describes Marduk organising the heavens and establishing the calendar. He sets the positions of stars, defines the year as 360 days, later adjusted to 365.25 through intercalary months, establishes the 12 months corresponding to 12 zodiac constellations, and assigns 3 stars to each month. The text is explicit. This is deliberate design, not natural observation. The cosmos is organised, measured, and divided according to a mathematical system. That's an unusual creation narrative. Most cultures describe creation as speech, combat, birth, or crafting. The Enuma Elish describes it as engineering. The gods measure the universe. They assign numerical values. They establish cycles and proportions. The number 60 itself is sacred in Mesopotamian theology. An, the sky god, is assigned the number 60. Enlil is 50. Enki is 40. Divine rank is quantified. This isn't primitive numerology. This is a culture that understood the relationship between abstraction and reality, between measurement and manipulation. If you can measure something, you can predict it. If you can predict it, you can plan for it. If you can plan for it, you can control it. Control is the function of mathematics. Not understanding, control. You don't need to know why planetary orbits follow the patterns they follow. You just need to calculate where a planet will be on a given date so you can time agricultural activities, religious festivals, or political decisions accordingly. Sumerian astronomy was relentlessly practical. They weren't trying to explain the cosmos philosophically, they were trying to track it precisely. And they did. Babylonian astronomers, working from Sumerian foundations, calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time between successive appearances as morning or evening star, with an error margin of less than 1 day over 500 years. That's not naked eye stargazing. That's multi-generational data collection with mathematical modelling. How do you get there? You establish a measurement system that supports fractional arithmetic and long-term pattern recognition. You train scribes in that system. You build institutional continuity so observations compound across generations. And you attribute the system to a source authoritative enough that nobody questions or alters it. The Anunnaki served that function. When a Sumerian scribe used base 60, he wasn't using his system. He was using the system established by Enki or Nisaba. That gives it authority. It also absolves him of needing to justify or defend it. This is how the gods calculate. This is the correct method. Learn it. The conservatism of Mesopotamian scribal culture ensured the system's stability. Scribes copied texts exactly, preserved old measurement standards, maintained calculation tables across centuries. When the Babylonians succeeded the Sumerians politically, they adopted Sumerian mathematics wholesale. When the Persians conquered Babylon, they kept the system. When Alexander's Greeks arrived, they learned it. When Arab scholars preserved classical knowledge during the European Middle Ages, they transmitted Babylonian astronomy, which meant transmitting base 60 notation. And that's why, when you glance at your phone to check the time, the number of minutes and seconds displayed is calculated using a system designed in southern Mesopotamia between 3000 and 2000 BCE, attributed by its users to the Anunnaki, and preserved through 45 centuries of cultural change, technological upheaval, and linguistic evolution. You're not using Sumerian time because it's ancient or traditional or symbolic. You're using it because it's optimal for the purpose. Every alternative system tested over the past 4,000 years, duodecimal, decimal, various local schemes, has been less effective for dividing periods into practical fractions. The Sumerians got it right, or whoever taught them got it right. Either way, the system functions so well that altering it is more costly than maintaining it. That's the test of good engineering: persistence. Technologies that solve problems efficiently don't get replaced. They get integrated. The wheel didn't stop being useful when steam engines were invented. Written language didn't become obsolete when printing presses appeared. Base 60 didn't get replaced by base 10 because base 10 can't divide circles or hours as cleanly. When the Sumerians said this knowledge came from the Anunnaki, were they describing actual historical transmission from an earlier source? Were they encoding respect for accumulated wisdom in religious language? Were they creating origin myths to legitimize institutional knowledge? All three could be true. What's indisputable is the result: a mathematical system sophisticated enough to handle complex calculation without modern tools, flexible enough to adapt to astronomy and geometry and administration, and robust enough to survive every subsequent civilization intact. You inherit that system every time you measure a minute. That's not metaphorical inheritance, that's literal continuity. The Sumerian scribes who calculated time in base 60 and the engineers who designed your phone's operating system are using the same mathematical framework. 45 centuries of separation, same system, because it works. And if it works after 45 centuries, maybe the question isn't who invented it, but how did they get it right the first time? The Sumerians had an answer. They said they were taught. Whether you believe that is irrelevant to the technology. Base 60 divisions of time and angle are demonstrably optimal for pre-digital calculation. That optimality is why they persist. That persistence is why you're using Anunnaki technology, or at least technology the Sumerians attributed to the Anunnaki, to read this sentence. 60 seconds have passed since you started this section. 60 Sumerian seconds. 60 divisions of a minute that was old when Rome was founded, ancient when Christ was born, and still ticking on every device you own. The mathematics don't care about mythology, they care about divisibility, accuracy, and practical application. On those measures, the system the Sumerians said came from heavenworks as well as any system devised since. That's not faith, that's engineering, the geometry that built the world. In 1945, a mathematician named Otto Neubauer published a paper analysing an unremarkable-looking clay tablet in Columbia University's collection. The tablet, designated Plimpton 322 after its donor George Arthur Plimpton, had been acquired around 1922, origin uncertain, probably from the ancient city of Larsa in southern Iraq. It was damaged, the left side broken off, several lines erased or illegible. What remained was a table of numbers arranged in 4 columns and 15 rows. Neubauer proved that the tablet contained Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 integers a, b, c that satisfy the equation a plus b gugs c. The most famous Pythagorean triple is 3, 4, 5, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 9 plus 16 equals 25, which is 5 squared. These numbers describe right triangles, the geometric foundation of architecture, surveying and engineering. The tablet dates to approximately 1800 BCE. Pythagoras lived around 570 to 495 BCE. The mathematics on the tablet predate the Pythagorean theorem by over 1,000 years. That alone would make Plimpton 322 interesting. But the tablet goes further. The triples it lists aren't simple. They include numbers like 119, 120, 169, and 3367, 3456, 4825. These aren't triples you discover by trial and error. These are triples generated by an algorithm. Someone, some Babylonian mathematician working from earlier Sumerian foundations, understood how to systematically produce Pythagorean triples and arrange them in a table for practical use. The algorithm is sophisticated. The method involves selecting 2 parameters, p and q, then calculating a judge pq, b judge 2pq, and c judge p plus q. This generates valid Pythagorean triples for any choice of p and q. The tablet arranges its triples in decreasing order of the ratio BA, suggesting the scribe was organising them for easy lookup based on angle, different Pythagorean triples correspond to different triangle angles. Why does this matter? Because if you're a surveyor in ancient Mesopotamia, you need right angles. If you're building a temple, the walls must be perpendicular or the structure becomes unstable. If you're laying out a city grid, you need square corners. If you're calculating the area of an irregular field, you break it down into triangles and use the Pythagorean theorem. But Plimpton 322 isn't teaching the theorem, it's providing a ready reference. The scribe who copied this wasn't learning mathematics, he was using mathematics. This is an engineering tool. The same way a modern builder uses a manual listing standard angles or a trigonometry table, a Babylonian architect used Plimpton 322. And the mathematics are correct. Every triple on the tablet has been verified. Despite being copied onto clay with a reed stylus over 3,800 years ago, the numbers work. The geometry is accurate. Where did this knowledge come from? The Babylonians inherited Sumerian mathematics. Cuneiform mathematical tablets from the Sumerian period show similar computational sophistication. One tablet from Nippur, dated to approximately 2500 BC, contains an approximation of the square root of 2 accurate to 6 decimal places. The value listed is 1.414213 compared to the actual value of 1.414214. That's not a lucky guess. That's iterative calculation using a specific algorithm. Why would a Sumerian scribe need the square root of 2 calculated to 6 decimal places? Because the diagonal of a square with sides of length 1 is the square root of 2. If you're building a square courtyard and need to measure the diagonal for construction planning or material estimation, you need that number. The scribe calculated it, recorded it, and included it in a reference table for future use. These weren't theoretical mathematicians. These were practical calculators solving engineering problems. But the level of sophistication is startling. To calculate square roots to high precision, you need algorithmic thinking. You need to understand iterative approximation. You need notation capable of handling fractional values. The Sumerians had all of this. Their base 60 system allowed for precise fractional notation without decimals. Their scribal schools taught systematic problem-solving methods. Their economic and construction demands required applied mathematics on a daily basis. But again, where did the methods come from? How do you get from counting sheep to calculating square roots and generating Pythagorean triples within a few centuries? The Sumerian answer, Enki, taught mathematics. Nisaba taught calculation. The knowledge came from the Anunnaki and was transmitted to human scribes who preserved it in the Aduba schools. The archaeological answer, mathematics developed in response to practical needs. Accounting for grain distribution required arithmetic, surveying irrigation canals required geometry, temple construction required calculation. Both can be partially true. Practical needs drive innovation, but practical needs exist everywhere. Not every culture develops base 60 mathematics and Pythagorean algorithms. Something specific happened in Mesopotamia that enabled mathematical sophistication unusual for the time period, that something might be institutional. The temple economy created professional scribes. Professional scribes needed training. Training required standardized methods. Standardized methods accumulated into systematic knowledge. Once you have systematic knowledge preserved in writing, it compounds. Each generation builds on the previous one, except the archaeological record doesn't show gradual building, it shows sudden appearance. The earliest mathematical tablets from Uruk, dated around 3000 BC, already demonstrate place value notation and sexagesimal calculation. There's no proto-mathematics phase visible in the archaeological record. Either it developed somewhere else and was imported fully formed, or it developed in Mesopotamia during a period for which we have insufficient archaeological evidence, or it was inherited from an earlier source. The Sumerians said it was inherited. Every mathematical text, every astronomical record, every architectural plan is framed as implementation of knowledge received from the Anunnaki, whether that's literal history, religious metaphor, or institutional mythology. The framing is consistent, and the knowledge works. Not approximately, not good enough for Bronze Age technology. It works at a level of precision that remains applicable to modern engineering. Consider this: NASA uses sexagesimal notation for orbital mechanics. When calculating satellite trajectories or planetary positions, angles are measured in degrees, minutes, seconds. Why? Because converting between angular measurements and arc lengths is more intuitive in base 60 than in decimal. The mathematics of circles and spheres favour sexagesimal division. The Babylonians, working from Sumerian mathematical foundations, understood this 4,000 years ago. They calculated planetary periods, predicted eclipses, and tracked lunar cycles using the same base 60 trigonometry that modern astronomers use. The methods are the same. The precision is comparable given the technology available. That shouldn't be possible. Astronomy is cumulative. It requires generations of observation to establish planetary periods accurately. The longer your baseline, the better your predictions. Yet Babylonian astronomy reaches high accuracy relatively quickly. Within a few centuries of having organised observational programs, they're predicting Venus cycles with minimal error. The standard explanation: they had good observational methods, preserved records diligently, and applied mathematical modelling effectively. All true. But it assumes they started from zero, that no prior astronomical knowledge existed. What if they didn't start from zero? What if the sudden appearance of sophisticated mathematics in the archaeological record reflects not invention, but restoration? What if the flood narratives describe a catastrophe that destroyed infrastructure, but not all knowledge? What if the antediluvian king lists preserved memory of an earlier mathematical tradition? These are speculative questions. They're not mainstream archaeology, but they align with what the Sumerians themselves said: we didn't invent this, we were taught. And if they were taught, the question becomes, by whom? Earlier humans with accumulated knowledge? A pre-flood civilization? The literal divine beings they describe in religious texts? Metaphorical personifications of natural law? The answer changes nothing about the mathematics. Plimpton 322 lists Pythagorean triples correctly regardless of who calculated them. The square root of 2 is accurate whether computed by Sumerian scribes or inherited from an earlier source. Base 60 divisions of time and angle function optimally whether designed by gods or humans or developed through long trial and error. What matters is the technology itself, and the technology is everywhere. When you use a level to check if a surface is flat, you're using geometry the Sumerians understood. When you measure distance using triangulation, you're using methods recorded on tablets like Plimpton 322. When you calculate area, volume, or angle, you're employing mathematical principles that appear fully developed in the earliest Mesopotamian sources. This isn't primitive geometry. This is systematic, algorithmic, teachable mathematics preserved in institutional settings and transmitted across thousands of years with remarkable fidelity. The transmission worked because the knowledge was correct. Mathematical errors compound. If early Sumerian geometry were flawed, buildings would collapse, canals would fail, land surveys would be inaccurate enough that property disputes would destroy the system. But Sumerian cities stood for millennia. Their irrigation networks sustained agriculture for generations. Their mathematics worked. Because the mathematics worked, they were preserved. Because they were preserved, they spread. Because they spread, they became foundational. Modern geometry textbooks still teach the Pythagorean theorem. Engineering students still learn trigonometry. Surveyors still use right triangles. These aren't historical curiosities taught for cultural enrichment. They're active tools taught because they solve problems. The same problems the Sumerians solved, with the same mathematics the Sumerians used. Who they learned it from is an interesting historical question. How well it works is a demonstrable engineering fact. Plimpton 322 sits in Columbia University's collection, a fragment of fired clay covered in cuneiform numbers. It's been handled by dozens of researchers, photographed extensively, analysed mathematically, debated in academic journals. It's been called the oldest trigonometry table, a teacher's lesson plan, a student's reference, an architect's tool. What it definitely is, correct. Every number works. Every triple forms a right triangle. The mathematics are sound. Whether the scribe who copied it was recording human innovation or divine instruction, the geometry functions. And it's the same geometry that built the modern world, one right angle at a time, calculated with algorithms recorded in cuneiform, preserved for 40 centuries, still taught in classrooms, still applied on construction sites, still functioning exactly as the Sumerians said it would. That's not mythology. That's mathematics. And mathematics doesn't care who taught it. It just works. The tablets that predicted the sky. The British Museum holds a collection of clay tablets that shouldn't exist. Not in the sense that they're fraudulent, their authenticity is unquestionable. They shouldn't exist, because the knowledge they contain requires observational capabilities beyond what Bronze Age technology should allow. Tablet BM 34034, part of the series called Enuma Anu Enlil, records Venus observations with precision accurate enough to date the reign of King Amisaduqa of Babylon to within a few years. The tablet lists appearances and disappearances of Venus as morning and evening star over a 21-year period, noting exact dates using the Mesopotamian calendar. These aren't casual observations. These are systematic records of first and last visibility, heliacal risings and settings, intervals between appearances. Venus has a synodic period, the time between successive similar configurations relative to Earth and Sun, of approximately 584 days. But it's not exactly 584 days. It varies slightly due to orbital eccentricities. Tracking this variation requires multi-generational observation and mathematical modelling. The Babylonians did it. The tablet proves they did it. How they did it is the question. Enuma Anu Enlil is not one tablet. It's a series of approximately 70 tablets containing between 6,500 and 7,000 celestial omens. The name means when the gods Anu and Enlil, and refers to the opening line of the series. The tablets are organised by celestial phenomena, lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, planetary appearances, weather events, earthquakes. Each observed phenomenon is paired with an interpretive statement, usually a prediction about the king, the harvest, warfare, or political stability. Modern scholars call this astrology and dismiss the predictive content as superstition. Fair enough. The claim that a lunar eclipse predicts the death of a king is not empirically verifiable the way eclipse timing is. But the astronomical observations themselves are accurate. The eclipse predictions work. The planetary position calculations are correct. Tablet 63 of the series, the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, has been used by modern astronomers to reconstruct ancient chronology. By calculating backwards, when Venus would have been visible on the dates recorded, scholars can determine when Amisaduqa ruled. Multiple potential date ranges exist due to the complexity of celestial mechanics, but all of them place the observations between 1750 and 1550 BCE, which aligns with archaeological and historical evidence for the first Babylonian dynasty. The point: the observations are good enough to use for modern astronomical back calculation. That requires accuracy in both timing and positional data. You can't fake that. You can't get lucky. You need systematic observation over extended periods using standardized methods. How long does it take to develop such methods? How many generations of astronomers observing, recording, comparing, refining? Modern astronomy took centuries to achieve comparable precision for planetary positions, and that's with telescopes, accurate clocks, printing presses for disseminating information, and international collaboration. The Babylonians had none of that. They had naked eye observation, water clocks with limited accuracy, clay tablets for recording data, and institutional continuity through temple astronomy programs. Yet, they predicted lunar eclipses with success rates high enough to be useful for political and religious planning. The mechanism is documented. Babylonian astronomers discovered the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours 223 synodic months, after which lunar and solar eclipses repeat in similar patterns. If you observe an eclipse and record the date, you can predict that a similar eclipse will occur one Saros cycle later. Keep observing for multiple cycles, and you can identify which eclipses in the cycle are visible from your location. This works. Modern astronomers still reference the Saros cycle when predicting eclipses. The Babylonians discovered it through observation and pattern recognition, or they inherited knowledge of it from earlier sources. The Sumerian texts attribute astronomical knowledge to Anu the sky god and to Enki, who organised the heavens. The myth describes Enki establishing the paths of the stars, setting the calendar, determining the lengths of day and night according to season. These aren't described as natural observations. They're described as deliberate organisation. The cosmos is measured and structured according to divine plan. If you read that as mythology, it's cosmological poetry. If you read it as technical description, it sounds like someone mapping celestial mechanics and establishing a reference framework for tracking changes. The mould-up-in tablets, dating to approximately 1000 BC but preserving earlier material, contain star catalogues listing constellations, heliacal risings and settings, and intercalation rules for keeping the lunar calendar aligned with the solar year. The tablets are organised systematically, stars are grouped by visibility throughout the year, paths of planets are described, length of daylight is calculated for different times of year using shadow measurements. This is observational astronomy recorded with bureaucratic precision. The format resembles administrative records, dates, phenomena, measurements applied to the sky instead of grain stores. Why astronomy? What practical benefit does eclipse prediction provide to a Bronze Age civilization? Timing. Agriculture depends on seasonal cycles. Planting too early means crops freeze. Planting too late means insufficient growing season. Traditional agricultural calendars use observable signs, the position of certain stars at dawn, the arrival of specific birds, the blooming of particular plants. But these are local and variable. A universal calendar requires astronomical reference points that don't change with weather or geography. The Mesopotamian calendar was lunar, 12 months of 29 or 30 days, totaling 354 days per year. But the agricultural year is solar, 365.25 days. After 3 years, a purely lunar calendar drifts an entire month out of sync with seasons. To keep the calendar aligned, intercalary months must be added periodically. How do you know when to add a month? You could use observable signs. If spring festival is supposed to occur when barley ripens, and the barley isn't ripe yet, insert a month and delay the festival. That works locally, but creates coordination problems across multiple cities. Better to have a calculated rule, add a month in years 3, 6, 8, 11, 14, 17 and 19 of a 19-year cycle, keeping the lunar and solar calendars synchronized. The Babylonians developed such a system. It requires knowing the exact length of the solar year, 365.25 days, and the exact length of the lunar month, 29.53 days. Both require long-term observation and mathematical calculation. Once you have those numbers, you can calculate the intercalation cycle. The system works so well that it's still used. The Hebrew calendar, which is lunar-solar, uses the Babylonian intercalation cycle. The calculation rules are directly inherited from Mesopotamian astronomy. This is practical technology, not speculative cosmology or mystical astrology, but functional timekeeping that solves administrative problems. If you're running an empire, you need synchronized calendars. If you're collecting taxes on specific dates, those dates need to mean the same thing across multiple regions. If you're scheduling religious festivals that involve participants travelling from multiple cities, you need everyone to agree on when the festival occurs. Astronomy provides that synchronization. The sky is visible to everyone. The moon's phases are universal. If you can predict when the new moon will appear, you can coordinate activities across your entire civilization. And the Babylonians could predict it accurately enough that temples could schedule rituals months in advance, accurately enough that kings could plan military campaigns around eclipse predictions, either avoiding inauspicious eclipses or using them for psychological warfare, depending on whether the enemy knew the eclipse was coming. There's a famous account from Greek historian Herodotus describing a battle between the Medes and Lydians around 585 BC that was interrupted by a solar eclipse. Both sides interpreted the eclipse as divine disapproval of the war and immediately negotiated peace. Modern astronomical calculation confirms that a total solar eclipse was visible in Asia Minor on May 28, 585 BCE. What makes this interesting? The eclipse was predicted. Greek philosopher Thales allegedly predicted it and used the prediction to establish his reputation. But Thales studied in Babylon. He learned Babylonian astronomy. The prediction wasn't Greek, it was Mesopotamian knowledge applied in a Greek context. This pattern repeats throughout ancient science. Greek astronomy is heavily indebted to Babylonian methods. Ptolemy's Almagest, the foundational text of Western astronomy for over 1,000 years, incorporates Babylonian observations and calculation techniques. Islamic astronomers during the medieval period preserved and extended Babylonian astronomy. Modern astronomy traces its institutional lineage back through this chain to the astronomical programs of Mesopotamian temples. Because the observations were accurate, because the calculations worked, because the predictions were reliable enough to stake political decisions on. If the Babylonians developed this knowledge independently over centuries of careful observation, that's impressive. If they inherited foundational knowledge from earlier Sumerian sources who attributed it to the Anunnaki, that raises different questions about the origin of the knowledge. The texts are consistent. Astronomical knowledge came from divine instruction. Anu organized the heavens. Enki set the calendar. Shamash, the sun god, regulated time. These aren't metaphorical claims in the texts. They're stated as historical facts, part of the foundational establishment of cosmic order. Modern astronomy says the Babylonians discovered celestial mechanics through observation. Ancient texts say the Babylonians preserved celestial mechanics taught by the Anunnaki. The observations themselves don't distinguish between these interpretations. Accurate data is accurate data regardless of source. What's undeniable? The system works. 4,000 years later, we're still measuring time using the calendar framework developed in Mesopotamia. We've refined it. The Gregorian calendar has more accurate intercalation rules than the Babylonian system, but the basic structure is the same. 12 months, lunisolar synchronization, calculated corrections to prevent drift. When you check your phone for the date, you're using a system descended from Mesopotamian astronomy. When you note that an eclipse is coming, you're accessing knowledge first systematized in cuneiform on clay tablets. When you use a calendar at all, not just to track days, but to coordinate activities across populations, you're employing technology that first appears in organized form in Sumerian and Babylonian sources. The technology persists because it solves a problem that doesn't change. Coordinating human activity requires agreed upon time measurement. The sky provides universal reference points. Mathematics allows prediction. Writing preserves observations across generations. Combine them and you get a calendar. The Sumerians had all three elements: astronomy, mathematics, writing, integrated into a single system they attributed to the Anunnaki. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, ancestors, pre-flood civilization, or mythologized natural wisdom, the integrated system remains functional. And it's not just calendars. The astronomical observations recorded in Enuma Anu Enlil include planetary positions, stellar risings, weather patterns, and geological events. Some of the omens are clearly superstitious. If Mars approaches the Pleiades, the king will die isn't predictive. But others encode practical knowledge. If a halo surrounds the moon, rain will follow is accurate observational meteorology. The tablets mix empirical observation with interpretive prediction. Separating the two requires modern scientific method. But the observational data embedded in the omens is valuable enough that historians of astronomy still study these tablets to reconstruct ancient observations of comets, meteors, and other transient phenomena. A tablet might say if a meteor falls from the northern sky, the enemy's land will be destroyed, which is interpretive nonsense. But it also records that a meteor was observed falling from the northern sky on a specific date, which is useful astronomical data if you're tracking meteor showers or reconstructing ancient atmospheric events. The Babylonians, working from Sumerian foundations, were observer scientists who embedded their data in religious, political, interpretive frameworks. That doesn't invalidate the observations. It contextualizes them within the culture that made them. And that culture said, we learnt this from the Anunnaki. We learned to track the sky, predict cycles, organize time, coordinate civilization according to celestial rhythms. Whether you interpret that as mythological self-understanding or historical memory, the technology functions. Every satellite in orbit is tracked using coordinate systems descended from Babylonian astronomy. Every GPS calculation uses angular measurements derived from sexagesimal divisions of the sky. Every calendar app on every phone implements a lunar-solar synchronization strategy developed in Mesopotamia. The Anunnaki technology, or at least the technology the Sumerians and Babylonians attributed to the Anunnaki, is currently orbiting Earth, calculating your position, telling you the date. It's not in museums, it's not ancient history, it's infrastructure, still operating, still predicting, still dividing time and sky according to principles first recorded in cuneiform and attributed to beings who came from heaven to earth. Whether those beings were gods, teachers, or metaphors, the predictions still work. The eclipses still follow the Saros cycle. The calendar still synchronizes. The sky still obeys the mathematics recorded on tablets over 4,000 years ago. That's not belief. That's observation. The same kind of observation that created the system in the first place. And it's still functioning today. Water that flows through time. The Diyala River, a tributary of the Tigris in eastern Iraq, flows through a landscape transformed by human engineering for over 5,000 years. Archaeological surveys have documented more than 1,000 kilometres of ancient canals in this region, many dating to Sumerian and Akkadian periods. These aren't simple ditches. These are engineered waterways with calculated gradients, controlled flow rates, distribution networks branching to multiple destinations, and maintenance systems that kept them operational for centuries. Water flows downhill. That's physics. But controlling how fast it flows, where it goes, how much reaches each destination, preventing erosion, managing silt accumulation, that's engineering. Sophisticated hydraulic engineering that requires understanding of fluid dynamics, long-term environmental effects, and mathematical calculation of optimal channel dimensions. The Sumerians built these systems. Or more precisely, the Sumerians maintained and expanded these systems, which they attributed to Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and engineering. Enki's temple in Eridu, the Iabzu, was built over a freshwater spring. The temple complex included channels directing water through the structure for ritual purposes, but also for practical cooling and waste management. Later Mesopotamian temples incorporated elaborate water systems, fountains, pools, ablution basins, drainage that required constant water supply and removal. The engineering is integrated into the architecture from the foundation level. This isn't accidental. This is planned design implementing hydraulic principles from the start. The Sumerian irrigation network was more extensive than Egypt's. The Nile floods predictably, depositing fertile silt and providing water at times aligned with agricultural cycles. Managing Nile irrigation is comparatively straightforward. Build basins to capture floodwater, release it gradually as water level drops, plant in the fertile silt. The Tigris and Euphrates flood unpredictably. The timing varies by weeks or months depending on snowmelt in distant mountains. The flood volume varies annually. The rivers carry less silt than the Nile. Worse, the soil in southern Mesopotamia is prone to salinization. When irrigation water evaporates, it leaves salt deposits that accumulate over time, eventually rendering land infertile. Supporting large urban populations in this environment requires active water management. You can't just wait for floods and plant in the mud. You need canals to bring water when and where you need it. You need drainage to prevent waterlogging and salt accumulation. You need storage basins to buffer against unpredictable supply. You need the mathematical ability to calculate flow rates and channel dimensions. The Sumerians had all of this. Archaeological evidence from Uruk, Ur-Lagash and other city-states shows extensive canal networks with features indicating sophisticated design, check dams to control flow, sluice gates to redirect water, distribution channels branching at calculated angles to ensure even flow splitting, drainage channels parallel to irrigation channels to manage excess water. These aren't trial and error systems. Trial and error produces failed canals, eroded channels, silted networks, and abandoned fields. The Sumerian networks sustained cities with populations in the tens of thousands for over a millennium. Some canal systems were used continuously from 3000 BC through 2000 BC, 1,000 years of operational functionality. That longevity requires maintenance, which requires institutional continuity, which requires administrative systems tracking canal conditions, labour allocation for dredging and repair, and dispute resolution when water distribution becomes contentious. All of that is documented in Sumerian cuneiform tablets. Administrative texts from Lagash record labour assignments for canal maintenance, 80 men 5 days, dredging canal of Ningirsu. Other tablets record water rights disputes adjudicated by temple authorities. Others calculate water volume required for specific field areas and allocate resources accordingly. The Gudea cylinders inscribed around 2125 BCE contain detailed descriptions of hydraulic projects undertaken during temple construction. Gudea describes digging canals, directing water sources, creating a pure water supply for ritual purposes. The language is specific. From the Tigris I dug a canal, and in my city, for the sake of my lady, the pure water I directed there. This isn't poetic metaphor. This is project description. The text continues with measurements, material specifications, and completion timelines. It's an engineering report embedded in a religious narrative. Why does that matter? Because modern irrigation engineers still face the same challenges the Sumerians faced, calculating optimal channel dimensions to minimize erosion while maintaining flow velocity, managing sediment deposition, preventing salt accumulation, ensuring fair distribution across multiple users. The solutions are mathematical. Channel cross-section must balance volume per and deeper allows more water against velocity, faster flow causes erosion, slower flow allows silt to settle. The optimal balance depends on soil type, water volume, desired flow rate, and gradient. The Sumerians calculated this. We know they calculated it because their canals worked. If the mathematics were wrong, the systems would fail quickly. Erosion destroys a mis-engineered canal within years. Silt accumulation blocks flow within seasons. But the Sumerian networks operated for centuries, which means the calculations were right. How did they get the calculations right? The texts say they were taught by Enki. Archaeologists say they developed the knowledge through experience, observing which systems worked, and refining designs over generations. Both processes could operate simultaneously. Even if the Sumerians inherited foundational hydraulic knowledge attributed to the Anunnaki, they still needed to adapt it to local conditions, innovate solutions to new challenges, and train each generation in maintenance technique. What's documented is the result: functional irrigation systems that enabled civilization in an environment that otherwise couldn't support large populations. And those systems were built following principles that remain valid in modern hydraulic engineering. When water is directed through a modern irrigation channel, the engineers consider the same factors the Sumerians considered: gradient, flow rate, channel dimensions, material stability, long-term maintenance. The tools are better. We have pumps, concrete, plastic liners, accurate measuring instruments, but the physics are identical. Water still flows downhill. Velocity still correlates with erosion. Silt still settles in slow-moving water. The Sumerian solutions to these problems were effective enough that they're still recognizable as solutions. Modern engineers looking at Sumerian canal remains can identify the design logic. This channel was sized to handle spring runoff. This distribution point splits flow evenly to 3 branches. This settling basin captures silt before water enters the main network. The knowledge is still valid because the problems haven't changed. Gravity hasn't changed. Fluid dynamics haven't changed. The mathematics of water management are universal. And the Sumerians said they learnt those mathematics from Enki, who emerged from the Abzu, the primordial freshwater source beneath the earth, and taught humanity how to channel water for civilization. Whether Enki is a god, a mythologized memory of early hydraulic engineers, or a symbol of accumulated wisdom, the irrigation systems are real. They worked. Their descendants, modified and expanded by Babylonians, Persians, Islamic empires, and modern nations, still channel water through the same region using the same basic principles. The canals themselves are mostly gone, buried under millennia of silt, or destroyed by later construction. But satellite imagery shows their traces: linear features in agricultural fields, soil discoloration marking ancient channels, subtle elevation changes where canal banks once stood. Archaeologists use this imagery to map ancient water systems, reconstructing the engineering that supported Sumerian civilization. What they find is consistent, planned networks, systematic design, maintenance infrastructure, and longevity that demonstrates functional effectiveness. You can't fake that. You can't sustain cities for centuries on failing irrigation. Either the systems work or the cities collapse. The Sumerian cities stood. Therefore the systems worked. Therefore the engineering was sound. Therefore the knowledge was valid. Where that knowledge originated, divine instruction, accumulated human experience, inherited pre-flood technology, is historically interesting but technologically irrelevant. The systems function regardless of source attribution. What matters is that the technology the Sumerians attributed to the Anunnaki is still the technology modern engineers use when managing water. The principles are the same, the mathematics are the same, the challenges are the same. 4,000 years later, when a farmer in Iraq opens a channel to water his field, he's participating in a technological tradition that traces back to the Sumerian canal networks, which trace back to Enki, who the texts say taught humanity how to bring water from its source to where it's needed. The water still flows. The fields still grow. The technology still functions. That's not mythology. That's hydraulic engineering. And it's been working continuously since before writing recorded its existence. The ME, divine technology or knowledge capsules, The Sumerian word me has no perfect translation. Scholars render it variously as divine powers, attributes of civilization, fundamental principles, or cultural norms. But in the texts, me behaves like something concrete, something that can be counted, carried, transferred, stolen, and implemented. The most detailed description appears in Inanna and Enki, preserved across multiple tablets, including CBS 15283 and CBS 9800 in the University of Pennsylvania's collection. The narrative describes Inanna travelling from Uruk to Eridu to visit Enki. He welcomes her with a feast. They drink beer, a lot of beer. In his intoxicated state, Enki offers Inanna the me, all of them. The text lists them, over 100 me, including lordship, godship, the crown, the throne, kingship, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of straightforwardness, the plundering of cities, setting up of lamentations, rejoicing, deceit, the rebel lands, the art of being kind, being on the move, being secure, being neglected, fear, strife, victory, counselling, judging, decision-making, the black garments, the coloured garments, the standard, the quiver, sexual intercourse, kissing, prostitution, the art of the elder, the art of the hero, the art of power, treachery, straightforwardness, destroying cities, lamentation, rejoicing, reverence, procession, the office of the high priestess, the office of the Ishib priest, the office of the Luma priest, the office of the Gouda priest, truth, descent to the underworld, ascent from, the underworld, the eunuch, the sacred prostitute, the tavern, the art of metalworking, the art of leatherworking, the art of building, the art of basket weaving, wisdom, attentiveness, holy purification, fear, awe, being on the move, being at rest, being troubled, judging, decision-making, the list goes on. Some me are abstract, truth, justice, wisdom. Others are highly specific, the art of metalworking, basket weaving, building. Some are social roles, kingship, priesthood, prostitution. Others are emotions, fear, joy, lamentation. The structure is unusual. If me were simply aspects of civilization, why list them as discrete, transferable items? Why does the text say Enki gave them to Inanna, and she took them and loaded them on her boat? The narrative continues. Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done. He sends his servant to retrieve the me. The servant pursues Inanna. She refuses to return them. Multiple attempts are made to stop her. She escapes each time, arriving in Uruk with the me intact. She unloads them from her boat and distributes them to her city. The text describes this as physical transfer. The me go from Eridu to Uruk. They're transported in a boat. They're unloaded upon arrival. This isn't metaphorical cultural diffusion, it's described as moving objects. What if that's literal? What if me were information packages? Knowledge systems that could be learned, recorded, and transmitted? Not abstract virtues, but specific capabilities, each representing a domain of systematic knowledge? Consider the art of metalworking. That's not an abstract concept. That's a body of knowledge including ore identification, smelting techniques, temperature control, alloying ratios, forging methods, tool design. It's information that must be learned and practiced. It can be taught from one person to another, from one city to another. It's discrete. You either have metalworking knowledge or you don't. Now consider kingship. In Sumerian culture, kingship isn't just political power. It's an organised system including succession rules, administrative structures, ritual responsibilities, military command, legal authority, economic management. It's a framework for organising power that can be transferred from one dynasty to another, one city to another. It's systematic knowledge, not arbitrary. If you frame me as systematic knowledge, protocols, techniques, organisational frameworks, Then the Inanna and Enki myth describes knowledge transfer. Inanna acquires civilization technologies from Enki's center in Eridu and brings them to Uruk, establishing Uruk as a major civilization center. That's exactly what happened historically. Uruk became the largest city in Mesopotamia during the late 4th millennium BC. It had monumental architecture, advanced pottery, long-distance trade, administrative complexity exceeding earlier sites. If you needed to explain how Uruk suddenly became dominant, you might say it acquired the ME from the older centre at Eridu. The myth might encode political reality, knowledge systems and organisational methods developed in earlier settlements were adopted and adapted by newer cities. The transfer was real, just not supernatural. But the Sumerians didn't describe it as cultural diffusion. They described it as Enki giving Inanna the ME. The language implies that Enki possessed something concrete that could be transferred, not just awareness of techniques, but the techniques themselves, encoded in a form that could be moved from place to place. What form? Written instructions? Trained specialists? Physical tools? All three? The answer is probably all three. Knowledge systems include documentation-scription, practitioners in Kabul, and tools in Orbli. Transferring metalworking knowledge from Eridu to Uruk would involve bringing tablets with techniques, expert metalworkers to train others, and possibly sample tools or materials. From this perspective, ME are technological packages. The ME of metalworking includes instructions, training and tools. The ME of kingship includes laws, administrative methods, and symbolic regalia. The ME of writing includes tablets, scribal training, and styluses. This interpretation makes the list in Inanna and Enki comprehensible. Each ME represents a distinct knowledge domain. Together they constitute the entire knowledge base of Sumerian civilization. Enki, as keeper of wisdom, holds all the ME. Inanna, through cleverness, acquires them and brings them to her city. But the text says Enki received the ME from An, the supreme sky god. He didn't invent them, he was given stewardship. This pattern repeats throughout Sumerian mythology. The Anunnaki establish the ME, assign them to various gods, and those gods manage human access to specific ME. If ME are knowledge systems, then the Anunnaki established the knowledge systems that define civilization. They didn't give abstract blessings, they gave metallurgy, writing, law, architecture, agriculture, governance, specific functional knowledge domains that enable organized society. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, advanced humans, or mythologized ancestors, the ME they established are real. We have evidence of every technology listed as an ME. Metalworking, documented in archaeological remains. Writing, thousands of tablets. Kingship, political structures evident in administrative records. Temple roles, extensively documented. Building, monumental architecture everywhere. The ME aren't mythical. They're the actual components of Sumerian civilization. Each one a distinct technological or organizational system. The mythology explains their origin. They came from the Anunnaki. The archaeology confirms their existence. They're present in the archaeological record as functional technologies. Modern civilization still uses most of them. We have different names, governance structures instead of the ME of kingship, construction techniques instead of the art of building, but the underlying knowledge systems are the same. When you follow building codes, you're implementing the art of building. When you participate in government, you're engaging with the ME of kingship. When you use written language, you're accessing the ME of scribeship. These aren't poetic metaphors. These are systematic knowledge domains that must be learned and transmitted. The Sumerians said these systems came from the Anunnaki, were managed by specific gods, and were gradually transferred to humanity. That's a creation myth. But it's a creation myth about technology, not about the cosmos or human nature. It explains where civilization came from, not from gradual human development, but from knowledge transfer from the Anunnaki. If you read that literally, you get ancient astronauts or lost civilizations. If you read it metaphorically, you get mythologized acknowledgement that knowledge has sources, teachers, predecessors, accumulated wisdom. If you read it functionally, you get a list of technologies that actually exist and actually work. The function is what persists. The ME, whatever they originally were, are now embedded in civilization itself. You can't have modern society without governance, law, construction, writing, mathematics, metallurgy, agriculture, administration. These are the foundational technologies. And the Sumerians said they came from the Anunnaki, described them as discrete, transferable packages, listed them systematically, attributed them to divine sources rather than human invention. That attribution might be religious belief, it might be cultural humility, it might be historical memory of receiving knowledge from earlier sources, it might be accurate documentation of knowledge transfer from a predecessor civilization. What's certain, the ME function, the technologies work. The organisational systems enable civilization. Whether you credit the Anunnaki, human ingenuity, or gradual cultural evolution, the result is the same. You're living in a civilization built on the ME. Every institutional structure, every technical practice, every systematic knowledge domain that makes modern life possible traces back, in some form, to knowledge systems first documented in Sumerian cuneiform and attributed to the Anunnaki. The ME aren't in museums, they're in operation. Every government, every construction project, every written document, every legal system, every professional skill is an ME in action. The technology, the Sumerians said, came from the Anunnaki is the technology that built the world. It still functions. It's still being transferred from teacher to student, from book to reader, from institution to institution. The Sumerians just called it ME and said it came from the sky. We call it civilization and take credit for inventing it. But the knowledge systems themselves, they were already systematic when the Sumerians received them, already organised when they were written down, already functional when they were first documented. That's what the ME are, functional knowledge, already systematised, attributed to sources older than human memory. And they still work. The technology we inherit every morning. The Weld Blundell prism sits in its climate-controlled case. The clay is the same temperature as when you first held it in the opening of this narrative. The cuneiform impressions haven't changed. The king list hasn't rewritten itself. But your understanding of what you're seeing might have shifted. This isn't an artifact describing ancient gods and impossible reign lengths. This is a technical manual's table of contents, a list of who held stewardship over which knowledge systems during which periods. The antediluvian kings with their enormous reign lengths, perhaps they're not measuring years, but measuring institutional continuity, cycles of knowledge transmission, or units of time calculated in a system we no longer recognise. The flood that ends the list. Perhaps it's not supernatural judgment, but documented catastrophe, a real disaster that destroyed infrastructure and nearly destroyed knowledge with it. The post-flood kings with their shorter reigns, perhaps that's the restart, the rebuilding, the restoration using preserved knowledge from before the crisis. And the Anunnaki, mentioned throughout Sumerian literature as the source of civilization, perhaps they're not gods in the supernatural sense and not aliens in the extraterrestrial sense, but the name the Sumerians used for whoever came before them and left behind functioning systems. What came before? Another human civilization that rose and fell before the flood? An earlier Mesopotamian culture whose infrastructure was destroyed, but whose knowledge survived in oral tradition, later recorded in writing? A prolonged development period whose archaeological evidence is lost beneath meters of silt deposited by the flood? A metaphorical acknowledgement that knowledge accumulates across generations and no generation invents everything from scratch? The answer doesn't change what you're using right now. You woke up this morning and checked the time. Hours divided into 60 minutes. Minutes divided into 60 seconds. Sumerian mathematics. Attributed to Anunnaki instruction. You navigated to wherever you are now. Directions measured in degrees. 360 around a circle. Divided into 60 minutes of arc. Each divided into 60 seconds. Sumerian geometry. Attributed to divine teaching. You're reading these words. Written language. Encoding sounds and concepts using arbitrary symbols combined according to grammatical rules. Technology that appears suddenly in Mesopotamia around 3400 BC with no evident developmental precursors. The Sumerians said Nisaba invented it. We say humans invented it through practical necessity. The technology functions either way. If you drove here, you used wheels. If you're indoors, you're in a building constructed using principles of load-bearing, right angles, and material stress that the Sumerians documented 5 centuries ago. If you've eaten today, your food was grown using irrigation techniques or descendants of irrigation techniques first systematized in Mesopotamia. If you've used a calendar, calculated any measurement, accessed any professional skill, participated in any governmental or legal process, you've engaged with knowledge systems that appear fully formed in the Sumerian archaeological record and are attributed by Sumerian texts to the Anunnaki. The technology isn't ancient, it's current. It's operational. It's the foundational infrastructure of modern civilization. When the Sumerians said the Anunnaki gave humanity writing, they were describing the origin of every book, every document, every screen of text you've ever read. When they said the Anunnaki established kingship and law, they were describing the origin of every government, every legal system, every organizational structure you've ever encountered. When they said the Anunnaki taught mathematics, architecture, irrigation, medicine, astronomy, they were describing the origin of technologies you use without thinking about their origin. Were they right? Were the Anunnaki real in some sense? Were the divine, extraterrestrial, or advanced human predecessors? Or were the Sumerians mythologizing accumulated human knowledge, attributing to gods what humans invented? Both can be partially true. Human ingenuity is real. Cultural learning and innovation happen. But knowledge also has sources. Every generation learns from the previous one. Every civilization builds on foundations laid by predecessors. The Sumerians position themselves as inheritors, not inventors. Whether that's religious humility or historical memory, the positioning is consistent across thousands of texts. And the technologies they inherited, or said they inherited, are sophisticated enough to remain optimal for their purposes millennia later. Base 60 for time and angles hasn't been improved. Wheel technology hasn't been replaced. Written language hasn't been superseded. Geometric principles still govern construction. Irrigation still follows hydraulic laws. Mathematics still uses methods documented in cuneiform. That persistence is remarkable. Most technologies get replaced. Stone tools gave way to metal. Horses gave way to engines. Gas lamps gave way to electricity. But the Sumerian core technologies, writing, mathematics, timekeeping, governance, architecture, agriculture, persist because they solve problems so elegantly that alternatives are less efficient. That's not luck. That's optimal design. Either the Sumerians were extraordinarily brilliant, inventing optimal solutions to complex problems on the first attempt, or they were implementing knowledge from sources that had already refined these systems through long use. The Sumerians said it was the latter. They said they received optimized knowledge systems from the Anunnaki. Modern scholarship says it was the former human brilliance creating sophisticated technologies rapidly in response to urbanization pressures. The technologies themselves don't resolve this debate. Functional systems are functional regardless of origin. Accurate mathematics are accurate whether invented or inherited. Effective governance structures are effective whether designed by humans or taught by predecessors. What you can verify, the systems work. They've worked continuously for over 4,000 years. They work well enough that changing them is harder than maintaining them. They work consistently across different cultures, languages, and technological contexts. When Roman engineers built aqueducts, they used geometry documented in Sumerian tablets. When Islamic mathematicians advanced algebra, they used base 60 notation inherited from Babylonian astronomy. When Renaissance architects designed cathedrals, they used proportions and load-bearing principles known to Sumerian temple builders. When modern programmers design software, they use written language and mathematical notation descended from cuneiform. The chain is unbroken. Each link adds refinement, but the foundational technologies remain. You can trace GP's navigation back through coordinate systems, through astronomical tables, through sexagesimal mathematics, through Babylonian astronomy, through Sumerian observation programs, through the ME that the texts say Enki received from An, through the knowledge the Anunnaki established, when they founded civilization. At each step, the technology is real. At each step, it functions. At the origin point, the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, the technology appears suddenly, works immediately, and is attributed to sources older than the Sumerians themselves. That origin attribution might be mythology, it might be history, it might be something in between. But the technology, that's not ambiguous. It's real, functional, and still operating. You're using it right now. As you track time, navigate space, read information, and participate in civilization, you're implementing Anunnaki technology, or at least technology the Sumerians attributed to the Anunnaki, and documented in clay tablets that describe impossible kings, divine instruction, and knowledge systems. That descended from the sky. The impossible kings might remain impossible, the divine instruction might remain unprovable, but the knowledge systems are demonstrably real. They built Sumerian cities, they built Babylonian empires, they built modern civilization. They're still building. Every new structure uses geometry the Sumerians recorded. Every new day uses time measurements they systematized. Every new idea uses language they developed. Every new coordination of human activity uses organizational methods they documented. The question was never whether the technology functions. The question was where it came from. The Sumerians answered, from the Anunnaki, who came from the sky, established the ME, taught humanity civilization, and withdrew or departed, leaving the knowledge behind. Archaeology says, from human innovation responding to urbanization in challenging environmental conditions, producing sophisticated solutions through trial and error compressed into a narrow historical window. Both narratives acknowledge the same facts. The technology appeared suddenly, worked immediately, spread rapidly, and persists indefinitely. The difference is attribution. Who designed these systems? Who refined them to optimality? Who first calculated that 60 was the ideal base for time and angles? Who first created written phonetic language? Who first engineered irrigation networks that could sustain cities? Who first measured the stars precisely enough to predict eclipses? The Sumerians said, the Anunnaki did this, then taught us, and we preserved what they taught. We say, humans did this, and the Sumerians mythologized the achievement. The technology doesn't care which interpretation is correct. It functions the same way either way. Base 60 still divides cleanly. Writing still encodes language. Irrigation still follows hydraulics. Architecture still uses geometry. What you inherit every morning, the time you check, the language you read, the buildings you enter, the food you eat, the infrastructure that supports everything, is the end product of knowledge systems first documented in Sumerian cuneiform and attributed to beings they called Anunnaki. Whether those beings were gods, ancestors, advanced predecessors, or mythological representations of accumulated wisdom, the inheritance is real. You're not reading about ancient technology, you're using it. The Sumerians built a civilization on it 4,000 years ago. You're living in the civilization it built. The clay tablets remember where it came from. You decide whether to believe them. But the technology? That's not belief. That's mathematics. And mathematics don't lie. 60 seconds just passed while you read this closing. 60 Sumerian seconds measured in a system that's older than every empire that ever rose and fell, still ticking, still dividing time, still functioning exactly as the tablets said it would. The Anunnaki technology, whatever its source, still works. And you've been using it all along. The silent inheritance. There's a detail in the Gudea cylinders that most translations gloss over. In columns VE of cylinder A, Gudea describes the moment when Ningirsu shows him the temple plans. The text doesn't say he was given vague instructions or symbolic visions. It says he was shown a tablet with a plan drawn on it, a visual schematic, a blueprint. Gudea describes seeing the plan of the temple displayed before him. He lists specific measurements, the temple's length, width, height. He describes material specifications, which woods to use for specific structural elements, which metals for decorative elements, which stones for the foundation. This isn't mystical revelation, this is technical documentation. The interesting part, Gudea says he didn't fully understand the plan. He needed an interpreter. So Nanshi, a goddess of dream interpretation, explained the measurements and specifications to him. Even seeing the blueprint directly, Gudea required expert assistance to implement it correctly. What does that suggest? That the knowledge being transmitted was more advanced than the recipient's baseline understanding. Gudea was an experienced ruler, educated in the Aduba, literate in cuneiform, surrounded by skilled craftsmen. Yet the temple plan required interpretation. The technology being transmitted exceeded his current knowledge level. This happens throughout Sumerian literature. Knowledge is portrayed as coming from a higher source and requiring mediation, translation, or interpretation before humans can implement it. The ME must be transferred by a god before humans can use them. The astronomical observations must be revealed by Anu before humans can track them. The mathematical tables must be taught by Nisaba before scribes can calculate with them. Either this is religious framing, attributing human knowledge to divine sources for cultural political reasons, or it's describing actual knowledge transmission from more advanced sources to less advanced recipients. We do this today. When a professor teaches quantum mechanics to undergraduates, the students don't invent quantum mechanics themselves. They receive knowledge developed by earlier physicists. When an apprentice learns carpentry, they don't independently discover joint techniques. They're taught by masters who learn from their masters. Knowledge transmission is normal. What's unusual is claiming the ultimate source is non-human. Unless the Sumerians weren't claiming the source was non-human. Anunnaki means those who from heaven to earth came, but heaven Anna means sky, not necessarily a supernatural realm. If you're a Sumerian describing people who came from far away, from beyond the horizon, from distant lands, from the sky in the sense of from somewhere else, you might call them Anunnaki. This interpretation makes the text more comprehensible as history rather than mythology. A predecessor civilization, whether pre-flood Mesopotamian or from another region entirely, possessed advanced knowledge. They taught it to the Sumerians or left records the Sumerians preserved. The Sumerians, having no other framework, described the source as divine because the knowledge was so advanced it seemed beyond human capability. But there's a problem with this interpretation. The Sumerians were sophisticated thinkers. They understood the difference between human and divine. They recorded human achievements, military victories, building projects, legal reforms, without attributing them to gods. They were perfectly capable of saying, King so-and-so built this canal, without invoking divine intervention. Yet when they discuss the origin of writing, mathematics, astronomy, irrigation, metallurgy, they consistently attribute it to the Anunnaki, not as a casual religious gesture but as a formal origin statement. In the beginning, the Anunnaki established, this phrasing appears in administrative texts, not just religious hymns. It's treated as factual background information, not poetic invocation. So either the Sumerians systematically misattributed human innovations to divine sources for reasons we don't fully understand, or they were accurately documenting that the foundational technologies of their civilization came from sources they identified as Anunnaki. Both options are strange. The first requires explaining why a culture capable of precise record keeping would consistently misattribute their most important innovations. The second requires explaining who or what the Anunnaki were, if not literal gods. Maybe the answer is simpler. The Sumerians were describing what they observed. Advanced knowledge systems existed in their civilization. Those systems were attributed to sources predating current human memory. The sources were called Anunnaki. Whether those sources were pre-flood humans, foreign advanced civilizations, or something else entirely, the Sumerians documented what they knew. The knowledge came from before, from elsewhere, from the Anunnaki. And then they used that knowledge. They didn't just preserve it as sacred mystery, they applied it. They built cities using the mathematics. They organized society using the governance structures. They tracked time using the astronomical calculations. They irrigated fields using the hydraulic engineering. The knowledge was functional, not ceremonial. It worked in practice, not just in theory. That pragmatic implementation is why it persists. Technologies that don't work get abandoned quickly. Technologies that work get preserved, transmitted, and integrated into civilization permanently. The Sumerian technologies worked. They're still working. That's the ultimate verification, not archaeological evidence of origin, not textual claims about divine teaching, not theoretical arguments about cultural development, practical function across 45 centuries. When you measure time today, you're not trusting Sumerian religious beliefs. You're using Sumerian mathematics because the mathematics are correct. When you read written text, you're not endorsing ancient Near Eastern theology. You're using information technology that functions reliably. When you live in a building with right angles and load-bearing walls, you're not practicing Mesopotamian religion. You're inhabiting a structure built using geometry that works. The technology has been tested extensively by every civilization that came after Sumer, by every engineer who has calculated angles or measured time, by every architect who has designed buildings, by every farmer who has irrigated crops, by every person who has read or written language. The test results are unanimous. The technology functions, which means the knowledge underlying it is valid, which means whoever developed that knowledge, whether Anunnaki gods, advanced pre-flood humans, or gradual Sumerian innovation mythologized as divine gift, understood what they were doing. That understanding didn't vanish when Sumerian civilization ended. It transferred to the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, then Islamic empires, then Renaissance Europe, then the global modern world. Each transfer maintained the core technologies because changing them was harder than preserving. You're the current recipient of that transfer. The knowledge that the Sumerians said came from the Anunnaki has been transmitted through 4,000 years of civilization and arrived at you. You use it daily. You depend on it structurally. Your entire civilization operates on infrastructure built from that knowledge. Whether the origin is divine, human, or something in between, the inheritance is undeniable. You live in a world organized according to Sumerian principles, measured by Sumerian mathematics, coordinated by Sumerian timekeeping, structured by Sumerian geometry, and recorded by Sumerian writing. The Anunnaki, whoever they were, left knowledge that still functions. The Sumerians, whoever they were, preserved and transmitted that knowledge with sufficient accuracy that it remains valid. And you, whoever you are using it right now. That's not ancient history. That's current technology. still operational, still functional, still building the world, one 60-second interval at a time. The clay remembers, the mathematics endure, the technology persists, and every morning when you wake and check the time, you're inheriting the legacy of beings who came from the sky and taught civilization to clay, or so the tablets say. The tablets might be myths, but the inheritance is real. You're living in it.